accession prospect. And our other guest is from Bruegel, Heather Graby, who is a senior fellow here, with whom we have just finished a report on Ukraine accession. So I'm very pleased to join you. I mean, she's also, as you might know, she worked a lot and also gave policy advice on enlargement-related issues in the past decades. So I think we really have an excellent company to discuss this issue. And lastly, let me also introduce myself. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm very delighted to chair this discussion. So I suggest to basically quick start this discussion the same way as Ukraine quick started its accession process, because as all of us Ukraine applied a few days after Russia full-scale invasion started, submitted its membership application for the European Union, and this has been approved in record time in a few months by the summer of 2022. And by last December, the European Council also agreed to start accession negotiations with Ukraine after certain additional conditions are met. And basically the approval of the candidate status and the approval of the start of the negotiations really happened in a record time. If you look at countries in the Western Balkans, for example, many of them waited for these steps for decades. But nevertheless, the quick start doesn't mean that the whole process will be quick, and the situation is very, very challenging. So maybe let me start with you, Mr. Maternova, if you can give a bit of a background on where the position, the situation, the process is at this stage. So what Ukraine has to accomplish before accession negotiations can start, and if you can make a prediction, if not, then no problem, but if you can make a prediction, what time horizon would you give to such an accomplishment? So please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be part of a Bruegel discussion, and especially if I can be on a panel with my good friend Heather. It's always a good omen, as we have been discussing issues of EU enlargement for a long time. I think that Ukraine is in a fairly special situation, and I would like to take this opportunity to sort of give you both the background and maybe dispel a little bit some myth that exists around Ukraine's accession, and they actually were contained also in the questions that I got ahead of this meeting to sort of frame my thinking. And that's the following. You're asking about the timing and what's going to happen with Ukraine, and how fair or unfair that is to the Western Balkans that have been in the waiting room for such a long time. And I just would like to offer two quick perspectives before I sort of comment on the current situation here. I think I'm deeply convinced that nothing better could have happened to the Western Balkans than the candidate status and greenlighting of opening of negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova. I am very convinced about that because now we have a momentum in the accession process. Now we have a tone of debate among the European leaders about how and when, rather than if, the next enlargement takes place. There is a sense of inevitability that was not there prior to granting of the candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and granting European perspective and later candidate status to Georgia. The second thing I would like to say as a framing issue is that in fact, these countries very much deserve it. And especially in the areas of fundamental reforms, the rule of law framework, anti-corruption, fight against organized crime. These are issues that the three new entrants have actually worked on very, very diligently over the last few years. In fact, with a lot of energy put into it, under pressure of the local constituency, civil society, independent media, etc., and the donor community. In fact, even more than in the previous enlargement crowd, because they did not have to do the very technical and taking a lot of energy, sort of the same level of acquis alignment and all the technical steps. They, in fact, were able to concentrate on building the fundamentals of a democratic, pluralistic, prosperous society, and with a lot of our support and help. So I actually think that Ukraine, I said, is special because it's, and Moldova as well, is not starting from scratch. They are actually very well prepared for where they are now. I really hope that the consensus among EU member states will continue and will move through these preparatory steps rapidly, not to lose the momentum and not to frustrate the various actors, because the December summit green-lighted the opening of negotiations. But before that, we have to have, report on the 4 steps that Ukraine still needed to do, several others on the side of Moldova, then adopt the negotiating framework, then is the next intergovernmental conference, and only then the actual negotiations start. So between the actual starting of the negotiations and the green lighting by the Council, which is the political representation of the will of the member states, that time should not be too long, not to lose credibility and momentum in the process. And in this sense, I think that people here are both keen and prepared to start the negotiations. It will not be an easy process, as it never is. I went through it myself when Slovakia was negotiating, so we all know that it can be at times maddeningly frustrating process, but people are ready for it. So I'll stop here for the opening.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a very fair point that that indeed there is a great momentum now, and I wonder, Heather, whether you share this this view that it can also, I mean, Ukraine and Moldova's new status can also revitalize what's happening on the Western Balkans. But let me also ask you, Heather, that I mean, Ukraine is in a very difficult situation under the war. I mean, but it has to do major reforms to fundamentally change many of its systems, including its legal systems. So how do you see how difficult this task is, and what prospects you see for significant improvements in the coming months and years?
Well, the EU accession process is always extremely demanding for any country to join. And Katerina was referring to, when Slovakia joined in 2004, that took, Slovakia started negotiations in 1999. It took 5 years of very concerted effort. But of course, at that point in time, the EU's legal acquis communautaire, all of the legislation, was probably half what it is now in volume. And the euro had only just been introduced. We didn't have new things like the European Green Deal. The fact that the EU grows all the time and develops new areas of competence, new policies, means that countries have to run to catch up. But having said that, joining the negotiations provides an enormous motivation for countries to make reforms that may have been blocked for a very long time, to improve the capacity of the state administration, to deliver better services to citizens. It provides a momentum that can catalyze domestic reforms in a way that doesn't otherwise happen. It can have a transformative effect on countries because everybody feels this is the future of our country. Now, in the exceptional circumstances of war, that's extremely difficult because, of course, every Ukrainian has to focus on winning the war and on keeping the state working and delivering services to people, helping to keep things running during a really difficult period. So you could ask yourself, should the Rada be looking at aligning Ukrainian legislation with the EU acquis communautaire at this time? Well, yes and no. The no part would be because of the administrative constraints. Ukraine is now really lacking, has massive labor shortages. But the yes, the reason why it's worth doing is because of the additional help that Ukraine will get from the EU, but also the additional credibility that gives to Ukrainian reforms, which can help to bring in investment even while war risks are very present, which can help to bring in other donors from outside, and which also give a sense of predictability and direction for all of Ukrainian businesses as well as individuals, as well as ministries and the state administration. So it's this kind of all of government, all of country effort in the same direction, which tends to catalyze these reforms. I think what's going to be different for Ukraine than perhaps other countries is not that the acquis will be different. I think there will be no shortcuts. Ukraine will have to jump through the hoops like everybody else. But it's more the focus on rule of law could be especially beneficial for Ukraine. The EU has increasingly put emphasis on rule of law in its enlargement methodology with the good reason of wanting to ensure the future good governance of an enlarged EU, but also because of all of the problems with rule of law in some of the current member states, which it is unable to tackle while once these countries join. So the idea is to put more emphasis on this before accession happens. And that could bring immediate benefits to Ukrainians along the way. If it's possible to tackle areas of corruption in the state administration, which no previous government was really able to get to, if the anti-oligarch law can be enforced well, and so on. It's a real opportunity to get good governance on a new footing in the country with external help and pressure, which gives more credence and more power to the government in tackling it. But also when people are really fed up with corruption during the war. Opinion polls recently show Ukrainians are really, really fed up with it. So while there's a strong will to tackle it, but that means the EU needs to be very clear about what needs to happen. I know that this is something that Katerina and her colleagues in the delegation are very clear about, but the EU lacks a lot of very clear rule of law standards. It's something that is not spelled out in the Treaty on European Union. We don't have an acquis communautaire on governance, democracy, and transparent public administration. Those things the EU tends to outsource to the Council of Europe and others. So this is something where the EU is really going to have to develop much clearer standards in a kind of export model for Ukraine, Moldova, for the Western Balkans, where, by the way, there are also big problems with this, but also for its existing members.
Very good point. I mean, let me just indicate or cite one statistics. The EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has an indicator which they called well-governed indicator, which is they call it in the transition quality data sets that they use. And I mean, so they monitor all countries in the region, including Ukraine and other countries. And unfortunately, Ukraine stands very, very poorly. So there's just one candidate country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is behind Ukraine, by all other candidate countries ahead, and of course EU countries are even further ahead than Ukraine. Now this indicator includes many things, including rule of law, public governance, corruption control, and things like that. So I mean, certainly this is just one indicator, and Heather, you rightly emphasized that there are no clear benchmarks for rule of law, but I think there's a general understanding that there is a need for really a major improvement. So so Mr. Madanov, if I could ask on this particular thing on the rule of law and corruption control. So what concrete technical help the European Union provides to Ukraine to try to improve its laws, its administration processes, and so on?
Provide a lot of concrete help, and thank you very much. Sorry, I was muted. So we provide a lot of concrete help and support, and I'll get to that. But you now touched on something that is very dear to me in actually misspelling a lot of the myth around Ukraine. I was when we were doing the opinion that was the basis of giving it the candidate status. I mean, it was I went through with a fine-tooth comb through every paragraph and every sentence and every word, and there is this perception, and you just quoted one of the statistics, which is not really statistics, it's perceptions and very qualitative, that contribute to a fairly misleading picture, which has been very strongly reinforced for well over a decade by well-executed Russian narratives and disinformation, painting a picture Ukraine is so corrupt, it's practically a failed state. That was a deeply, deeply held belief until 2022, February, among pretty much all of my interlocutors. Then they got a shock in February. Oops, well, Kiev's going to fall apart. The government's going to be out in 2 weeks. And then people realize, well, that's not going to happen, and it's not actually a failed state. But the corruption narrative is still happily kicking around with us. I put my hand to the fire to say, is there corruption in Ukraine? Absolutely. But there has been such improvement in this area over the last 10 years since Maidan. There has been leaps improvement by leaps. Heather mentioned opinion polls. Absolutely. You now look systematically at opinion polls in Ukraine, and corruption is number 2. It's security, corruption, and only then well-being. Before the war, corruption was concerned that somewhere in the first 10 would have featured. And this creates incredible public pressure. Yes, people are fed up, but it also means that a lot has been done in this area. We have 4 very robust anti-corruption institutions: preventive, investigative, prosecutorial, and high anti-corruption court. They function, they are under strong leadership, and corruption in public perception is a crime. It's no longer the system. So there has been a paradigmatic shift, and in fact, I would say that the war very much contributed to it. I spoke about Ukraine being in a special category for several reasons, and I would add to it that the war has had, first of all, a liberalizing impact on the country, but that's a separate discussion. I mean, the values, the European values and tolerance and openness against minorities, LGBTI, etc., is actually much greater than it was prior to February 2022. But it also, the war has had a catalyzing impact on the reforms. So on the one hand, it's counterintuitive that a country that's fighting an existential war actually has the capacity, the bandwidth to do reforms. It's actually the other way around. It's the war that enabled the consensus to address some of the issues that were so difficult to address before, to overcome the vested interests and oligarchic structures, etc., of the past, to actually carry out important reforms. After 5 years of back and forth and trying and false starts, we have corporate governance reform. On the area of anti-corruption, huge steps have been done to a point that even in Transparency International, which is perceptions of corruption, Ukraine jumped 3 points just this year, and since Maidan, 11 points progress. So this is what I was saying, that because they were not part of the formal process, they actually, with the help and pressure and support, the ability to move on these fundamentals and build these blocks of the democratic governance. You were absolutely right, Heather, when saying there is no, the way I call it, there is no acquis on fundamentals, because the acquis by definition was created by countries that were at a certain level of development already, and democratic governance and prosperity, etc. So we don't have acquis on these building blocks. But despite that, we work with our partners. We work very actively in the G7 group of reform actors here, and push on the democratic governance, on the building blocks of a pluralistic society, but also a functioning market economy, etc. And there, Ukraine has nothing to be ashamed of in comparison with all of the accession countries. I think it stands in good stead. And part of it is, you asked about, Jolt, about the support. So we have, in fact, our flagship support projects, which do not only technical assistance, but really institution building, help with legislative work, help with advocacy in all of the main areas. And let me just name a few. One is Pravo Justice, that works on the whole area of judicial and prosecutorial reform. We have an anti-corruption project for a number of years that works on all the anti-corruption architecture and preventive as well as punitive side of fighting corruption. We've had a very successful, and continue with a very successful, decentralization project, which has been one of the flagship reforms of Ukraine that really changed the face of the country and the nature of governance. We have projects on public administration reform, public finance management, sort of all the main building blocks of governance, and then also investment climate and various support measures in economic regulation, whether it's competition or licensing, etc. So there is a series of support measures that we do either with member states, institutions, UN organizations, IFIs, or through private consultants that provide this kind of help. And last but not least, with EBRD that was already mentioned, we have developed a very, I think, solid and robust system over the last few years of Ukraine reform architecture, where we support young Ukrainians that are embedded in individual ministries and help with the reform agenda. So this is where we are, and what we continue. A number of our projects actually have few phases, because they've proven so well and so effective in what they do.
Thank you so much. In fact, you already answered one of the online questions, which asks what are the concrete help from the EU to enhance governance in Ukraine. And by the way, let me also encourage other online participants to, if you have questions, please go to Slido, #Ukraine, and I have a tablet in front of me, and I will have 2 more questions to our speakers, and then I will open the floor for questions, both who are here and also who are away. But now let me go to Heather and ask about the accession process. So you first of all, you advise policymakers and observed how accession process developed in the past, studied also very recently how the current accession process is. So what changes do you think, or what adaptations you think would be needed to make to tailor it for Ukraine?
Well, the accession process has now been underway. The rules were set in 1993 at Copenhagen, so it's been going for a long time. It's 30 years. So, and the methodology has been revised several times. I think there are several areas that really will need more development. One is the rule of law, just to make the standards simply clearer. As Katerina was saying, a lot has happened, and now guiding the reforms over the next few years, the EU will be enormously influential, and so it's important that the standards are really clear for everyone, particularly in that area on democratic governance, and it's about corruption, but it's also about democratic governance more broadly. So things like restoring freedom of the media after martial law. At the moment, media freedom is suspended under martial law, which is understandable. But post-war, there needs to be a restoration of various features of liberal democracy, which are not will no longer be appropriate. But then we will also need to see in the accession process really credible consistency from the EU side, and this is where I think a key thing to do will be to ensure that there isn't hostage-taking by individual member states of the accession process. At the moment, each of the 27 member states has about 140 veto points in the accession process of any country that wants to join. So all of the member states have to agree unanimously under the enlargement methodology to benchmarks that are set, to letters that are sent to about benchmarks, to the opening of each chapter, the closing of each chapter, and then there's the whole ratification and the entire treaty and so on. Now, there's unfortunately, we've seen some hostage-taking by individual member states over bilateral issues, or indeed matters that are not related to enlargement at all, where they've refused to allow a country to move forward even though it's met the conditions. This is really dangerous for the credibility and the effectiveness of the whole process. If a country is making difficult, painful reforms at home, where it's really hard to persuade the public and indeed domestic interest groups to do something, then they manage to do it, they get a consensus, they get it through their parliament, they do the thing, they've met the conditions, and then the EU turns around and says, sorry, you can't move forward because this member state doesn't like your language law, or that member state wants something else from the EU budget which we haven't been able to give it. This does not work, right? The whole process starts to break down. The only way you can maintain this catalytic effect is if the EU really does have a merit-based process where countries move forward if they've met the conditions, and also where they either sit in the same place or even move backwards if they no longer meet the conditions. And we've seen that happening in some of the countries in the Western Balkans, where there have been problems with democratic governance, some Russian influence that has caused changes of laws, and there the EU needs to be very clear, no, we're going to have to move backwards. The only way you can maintain the incentive structures set by the accession process is if the process really sticks to the rules, if the EU side sticks to the rules. So what I would like to see in the accession process is some revision whereby it's actually not in the treaties, it's simply a methodology that has developed over time, that there are these 140 veto points. We've got to find ways of optimizing, streamlining the process and making it very predictable and very consistent for the candidates. And then I think the third area where the accession process will need to be adapted is to take account of the fact that the countries now have done different things in different areas. So as Katerina was saying earlier, Ukraine and Moldova have actually done a lot of quite deep integration under the DCFTA, the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, that's been in place for a decade now. In some respects, they've gone further than the Western Balkans, which have a different set of legal arrangements, legal relationships with the EU. So they can move faster in those areas. But there are also new policy areas that the EU has, such as the European Green Deal, the digital agenda, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and so on. And in fact, in those areas and others, it would make sense that the candidate countries don't just join those things on the day of accession, but they start implementing them in advance. They go through progressive integration. Now, Katerina worked in DG NEAR on, for example, extending mobile roaming to Ukraine and Moldova. Great, fantastic to be able to do that well in advance of accession, deliver a benefit to the public of the country where people literally, can see the EU benefits of EU membership on their phone. But there are a lot of other areas. Ukraine, we'll discuss in the next session on energy. Ukraine could start integrating into parts of the EU's energy markets. A lot of potential there. Moldova would like to integrate into other parts of the EU. So this idea of opening up EU policies and ensuring countries can step by step come closer to the EU well in advance of accession, that would be an innovation. That would be something that didn't happen in the 2004, 2007, 2013 accessions. And it would really help Ukraine also, of course, with the enormous challenges of reconstruction.
Many thanks, Heather. Very good points. And let's hope that the next commission, which will come into office soon, will pick up this idea. Would you like to come in, Mr. Matanova?
Yes, just
Please.
quickly comment on this point, because this is really the critical point that Heather just made, and also referred to the deep and comprehensive trade, the free trade area. This and the association agreement that it was part of is the reason why the Eastern Trio is not starting from scratch. And what we are calling for, which is this step-by-step or progressive integration, which the Western Balkans are calling for, is something you can already actually do under the association agreement and the DCFTA. And in fact, for a terrible reason, or for terrible reason of the war, but Ukraine has already gotten very far advanced to a point that is creating backlash in individual member states, because it is already trading as if it was part of the internal market. It has access to the internal market. It has access to the agricultural market, etc. And all of that is duty-free and customs-free, as if it was part already of the internal market. And so the backlash you are seeing on the borders of Ukraine is because it's not a member yet, but it's actually already using these benefits due to the terrible situation of war, where the member states in solidarity actually did this earlier integration. So in the case of Ukraine, you in fact are going to have a dilemma. If the war were to end tomorrow, do you roll back what we have already extended to Ukraine, and then say, oh, you need a few more years to deserve what you already had in 23 and 24? So it's actually interesting, and the reason that the EU was able to so quickly do that is because the legal basis was the association agreement and the DCFTA, which has an inbuilt progressive integration. And this is the big difference to the Western Balkans, because the association agreements with the Western Balkans are of a previous generation association agreements that do not foresee this level of integration into the single market, into the free trade, etc. So you actually had, as a preparation for accession process in the Eastern Trio, you had the best of both worlds. You had far-reaching accession agreements and DCFTAs, which allow the countries to work on their fundamentals, but also in selective areas on acquis implementation, and also foresee these individual progressive steps. And so some countries took advantage of it, some not. In the Western Balkans, you have a very static situation where you have the enlargement process with all the 140 vetoes and all the procedural steps, etc., without the benefits. The benefits are the bullet repayment as we had in the 2004 enlargement, right? That you don't have any benefits while you negotiate and the benefits come on the same day once you exceed. And that's the logic that has led to the frustration with the Balkans, because there is no inbuilt framework through which you have the benefits while the negotiations have been going on.
Many thanks for highlighting this very important difference between the Ukraine's association agreement and the Western Balkan stabilization agreements, which is indeed a key issue. And in fact, it's good for Ukraine. Now, let's hope it will also good for the Western Balkans. But now our time is running, so let me open the floor for questions and comments. So I see already a couple of hands already in the room. So I suggest we collect comments. So, so when you give a comment, please briefly introduce yourself. And since time is short, try to be also brief.
Vitaly Sizov, UATV journalist. Could you suggest when we will see the draft of negotiation framework and the report about the progress of reforms? Could it be this month? Thank you.
Then I saw a couple of other hands over there.
Hello, I'm Alexander. Do you hear me? Yeah. I'm finishing my master's on energy politics in 2 months, and my question is about the economic side consequences of the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. So, for instance, so actually my question is, are there any measures foreseen to mitigate these economic side consequences? So for instance, the energy market of Ukraine is very highly regulated. Ukrainians do pay, if I'm not mistaken, at least 4 times higher prices, if not 8 times, I'm not sure. 8 times higher prices than the actual prices are at the moment. So compared to that, the European Union has a very liberated energy market, and Ukraine would need to do the same. And that would mean exploding energy costs. So are there any measures foreseen to mitigate that?
There's a gentleman over there.
Thank you. Sorry for taking the floor again. Yes, to discuss the elephant of the room, what reform do you foresee for the common agricultural policy in terms of Ukraine accession? Thank you.
A very easy question. And there is also a second question from the online audience, which is more political in nature, and it asks that with all the questions about reforming the EU, for example, abolishing unanimity, how likely is it that the countries pushing for reforms will accept Ukraine in the EU? So this is more political. I don't know whether you can respond it to not. So let me give back the floor to both of you. Again, try to be brief. Maybe the energy measure we could leave to the next session, because that will be entirely about energy. But a little bit on the time frame. There's also other economic consequences, CAP reform, and political acceptance. So maybe Heather, this time we start with you, if it's okay.
I think that Ambassador Matonova is the person to answer the question about the negotiating framework. She's working on it. So, and in terms of the timing in there. So I've studied enlargement now for about 25 years. And the question of, don't we need to reform the EU first before enlarging, always comes up. And the EU has never done it. The EU has always said, oh yes, we're going to reform. Oh yes, we're going to finally do something about some antiquated policies from the 1950s, which are still there in our budget. We're going to make a major change to streamline the way that, for example, voting works and qualified majority voting works. We're finally going to tackle all kinds of issues that have been stuck for a long time. And you know what? It's never possible to do that until it's 5 minutes past midnight, and a new country has has already joined and problems start emerging, and then the EU finally starts to think about actual reform. Think about, the Lisbon Treaty only actually came into effect a number of years after the 2004 and even 2007 enlargements. The budget reform has never really happened because of enlargement. So enlargement is a good kind of placard to wave to say, hey, we need to reform. But in reality, the EU has to tackle these issues among the current member states, and for reasons that are already evident now, not just about future enlargement. So I think with regard to the CAP, there are many other pressures on the CAP. You may have noticed that the farmers are not too happy about the current CAP, even though it's still taking up a third of the EU budget, in fact more than a third of the EU budget. It's not just about the subsidies that they are paid, it's all about the incentives that are set, the administration, all kinds of issues about farming today, which the CAP has clearly not resolved. There are also the major pressures on the CAP just in terms of environmental problems that industrialized farming that the CAP has promoted have caused to the European biodiversity, to water quality, air quality, and all kinds of other problems. So there are plenty of other reasons to go for it. And of course, there are other pressures on the EU budget. If the EU wants to keep the budget to only 1% of GDP, which is what the frugal member states want, and also to spend more on defense and do other things, then the biggest ticket items in the budget, which are agriculture and cohesion policy, there will have to be some adjustments. So I think it's a red herring, as we say in English, to talk about reform of budget items as being about enlargement. And remember also the timing is tricky. The budget runs on a 7-year time frame, and certainly no country is going to join during the current budget period. So it would be really for the next budget. So there's actually quite a long time to think about possibly 2 budget periods for some countries that will come in. But the EU needs to tackle it, but it's not mainly about Ukraine. And then on the institutional reform issues, there too, there's already a lot of pressure because of hold-ups, because of unanimity still being the rule in a number of areas. I think there will be pressure to use what's called the passerelle clauses in the treaty. These are clauses that allow the EU to move to qualified majority voting in certain areas. But it's true that all the turkeys have to vote for Christmas to come. So there's a problem that if you need a unanimous vote to move to qualified majority voting, then all the member states have to be convinced. So there are clearly some grand bargains to be struck between the existing 27 member states to get to this point. But I think that the accession process does not depend on and should not depend on these reforms within the EU. Some of them will happen in the interim because they're needed for other reasons now. Some of them will happen after more countries have joined. It's true that the EU needs to be fit for 35, shall we say, because if all the countries join, we could have 35 or more members of the EU. But we also have to remember that although these are a lot of countries, a lot of governments joining, a lot of seats at the table at the Council and the European Council, population-wise, they only amount to, all of the countries together, Ukraine, Moldova, Western Balkans, even Georgia added, only add up to about the population of the United Kingdom. So there's still a Brexit-shaped hole in the EU in terms of population. So you've got to think about all of these perspectives.
Very much, Heather. Ms. Matanova?
In fact, everything that Heather said in the response to the questions, I completely sign on to and absolutely agree. It's when you're asking about the common agriculture policy, it is not Ukraine joining. The problem is not going to be the money. The money that Ukraine will need for reconstruction is so much greater than anything that can be catered to through the current structures. And I think that the timing of accession, since it's not immediate, really offers enough time to give a fresh look to all of these policies. And I completely agree that there are other pressures that are putting other pressures from other sources that are being put on the legacy policies originating many decades ago. One of them being the state of the world right now and the role that the EU perhaps didn't choose to play, but will have to play on the geopolitical stage, and all the questions about defense and need to retool it in its industries, and as President Macron likes to say, the strategic autonomy of Europe is one of the big pressures. I see more complicated the institutional setup of the EU to be able to accept new members. But there again, I agree with Heather that while things intellectually may need to be done in sequence, real life is going to push the decisions through the political momentum and political imperatives, and then the EU will adjust. So I think, again, a long way of saying I completely agree with what you said, Heather. Now, quick reaction on the first and second question. As just quoting President von der Leyen, who was here in Kiev with us on the second somber anniversary of 24th of February, she committed to present the negotiating framework and by definition also the report on the 4 steps in mid-March. So I have every expectation that both the assessment of the 4 steps and the draft negotiating framework will see the light in the month of March. And my last point, and I'm not going to get into the full issue of energy, and you are going to have a separate panel on it, just to say one thing, that obviously now in the martial law and in the state of war, the energy system has been under particular pressure, and it has a lot of things and a lot of the reform dividends achieved prior to the war have been suspended or cannot be fully used right now. But the one thing that happened, in fact, thanks to the aggression and the attack already 10 days into, or 2 weeks into the full-scale invasion, was the connection of the Ukrainian and Moldovan electricity grid with the European continental grid. And this would not and could not have happened without a lot of very fundamental reforms that happened in the energy sector and electricity sector and the gas sector, but that's a separate issue, prior to that interconnection. So that's just, this was one issue that was discussed, and eventually we were going to look at the interconnection maybe in a year's time, and then the reality caught up, and this allowed the level of stability in the energy grid that we see in both countries over the last 2 years, and the fears were allayed. So once the martial law is over, I actually have very high degree of confidence that whether it's going to be freedom of media or whether it's going to be energy reforms, things will go back to which was the reform path that the country has been on.
So maybe just a couple of final points with regard to these questions. One is, I mean, there was a sort of question about will there be measures to mitigate the economic consequences of accession. Accession has been basically economically very positive for the European Union as well as for the acceding countries, because it tends to dynamize trade and it brings in investment. It provides a stable regulatory and political and economic situation which encourages investment. And so investment both in energy, we'll talk about that, the complications of doing that in the the next session. But on the whole, and Jolt, I mention this because Jolt is the chair and he's too modest to mention it, but he's done a lot of work on the positive impact of accession. But the other thing is that the budget impact of new members is an entirely political question. There's nothing automatic about it because the EU budget rules are made by the member states and they can be changed by the member states, and they frequently are. Poland had transition period for, I think, a decade before receiving the full subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy. And those kinds of transition periods can be used again. So I think the idea that there will be major negative economic consequences both for economies and for the budget is simply not evidenced by what's happened in the past. But what's really different about Ukraine's path to accession is the geopolitical nature of it, that anything can happen in the next years, in the war, in elections, and so on. And for that reason, there's a geopolitical imperative to make the accession process happen and to do it really well that is much greater even than it has been for Central Europe in post-communist transition and the Balkans in post-war reconstruction. It's really important that the EU is supporting Ukraine in the war, and the accession process is another way of doing that. So there can be no trade-off between the war and the accession process. They have to work together well, and I think this is a major challenge that the Commission is very focused on now. And the signals to Ukrainians about their welcome in Europe and the signal to the Kremlin and to the rest of the world about Ukraine's future in the European Union has to be an unambiguous and unwavering message from the EU, because the geopolitical value of the accession process lies in that credibility and that consistency from the EU side. So I hope we can manage to maintain that, come what may, over the next years.
Thank you very much. I think these are very nice closing words from both of you. So my last task, and please join me in that, thanking our two excellent speakers for these very insightful discussions.